21 of my closest colleagues signed a letter against me. The dean denounced me, and 15 student groups boycotted me unsuccessfully. Nobody ever said what you said is wrong or factually wrong. They just disagreed with my opinion.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Is it possible to talk back to the woke establishment in academia and the media? The battles over intersectionality and critical race theory generally involve disputes that place individuals in the crosshairs of institutions and their ruling establishments that are intolerant of dissent under even the best of circumstances. These arguments have also become inextricably tied up with partisan battles in which most Americans have chosen sides and then refused to listen to contrary arguments. But even worse is the way that intersectionality has become the engine driving the anti-Israel movement and efforts to boycott and isolate the Jewish state, as well as acting as a permission slip for anti-Semitism, not just in academia, but in mainstream political and social discourse. This has helped create an oppressive atmosphere of cancel culture that is antithetical to free discourse and academic freedom on college campuses, as well as one that forces the social isolation of Jewish students and keeps liberal supporters of Israel either cowed by the woke mob or determined to go along with it, lest they find themselves shunned. In the closed world of academia, these ideas have become unquestioned truth. In the political sphere, they are working to not just enforce ideological conformity, but to create a reality in which traditional liberal beliefs about meritocracy and individual rights, equality, rather than equity, are marginalized, if not altogether banished from the public square. But in this program, we're going to not merely analyze how dangerous this can be for the country's political health, as well as for Jews, but attempt to take a deep dive into these toxic ideas, understand where they came from, how they morphed into a catechism for a powerful movement, and why they have been treated as a respected and near unchallengeable way of looking at the world. To do that, we've invited a person who is not only one of the leading experts on how intersectionality and critical race theory work, but also the one leading one of the most effective efforts to get out the truth. William A. Jacobson is a clinical professor of law and director of securities law clinic at Cornell Law School, where he has taught since 2007. In 2008, he founded the Legal Insurrection website. In 2019, he launched the Legal Insurrection Foundation, a nonprofit research and investigative group focused on promoting free speech and open dialogue, capitalism and free enterprise, and understanding the intersectional left. This year, he launched criticalrace.org, a website that catalogs critical race training in higher education and at elite private schools through an interactive map. William Jacobson, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Great. Thanks, Bill. I want to start off by asking you about the fact that the way intersectionality has become a key factor in understanding both the push against Israel on campuses as well as progressive politics in general. Can you outline for us exactly where that idea came from and what it means and how it morphed into an idea from a percolating on the left and the far left on campuses into a major force defining our politics?
Well, I think that I'm pretty familiar with it. It was actually something developed by my law school classmate, Kimberly Crenshaw. It was originally developed in the employment discrimination area to put forth the concept that black women, for example, receive two forms of discrimination. One is sex discrimination and one is race discrimination. And you can't just pick one of those. They intersect with each other. And so you had to have an intersectional approach that would address different forces coming to bear on people. That's how it started. And now it's something very different. It morphed over time into a very racial identity politics sort of thing, almost a cataloging of victimhood and a ranking of victimhood, and a concept that there are forces in the world that are the source of these intersectional problems. And over time, that became the United States, capitalism, colonialism, and in the last 15, 20 years, it's morphed into the primary means of attacking Israel. The argument being that Israel represents the international intersectional problems, that there are religious problems, there are racial problems, there are capitalism problems, there are all these different things, and Israel is somehow become the embodiment of that, and that people need to unite against Israel and against the United States through forming intersectional alliances. So what you will often hear is that the problems that Black Americans have in the cities of this country with regard to policing somehow are related to problems that Palestinians allegedly have with policing in Israel, because there are all the same forces coming to bear. So you find these intersectional alliances being formed between people, mostly based on racial identity, people of color against Israel. And if you look at any campus coalition against Israel, that's how they form themselves. People of color versus Israel, Israel being the white oppressor, Israel being the equivalent of these intersectional problems that people have. So intersectionality actually is the primary tool used against Israel nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it lumps things together which have nothing in common, because it's rooted in this idea that sort of in all the world, all the good guys are the same and all the bad guys are the same, oppressors and oppressed. And somehow that means that the Palestinian war to destroy Israel is the same thing as the struggle for civil rights in the United States. You noted the idea about policing being very, core to it. Anti-Zionists, such as Jewish Voices for Peace, started this program called Deadly Exchange, which tried to pin the blame for police shootings in American cities of African Americans on Israelis who trained first responders, even though that had nothing to do with police work.
That's right. Deadly Exchange is something that we've followed since its inception, and it really is a very pernicious sort of approach to things, because it takes two things that have nothing to do with each other, tries to find a link, and then blames one for the other. So, for example, this really all started during the Ferguson riots in 2014, which is where Black Lives Matter got its real launch. It was formed as a hashtag after the Trayvon Martin shooting in 2013, but it really was Ferguson and the Michael Brown shooting that launched them to national fame. And that's where you saw this intersectionality. We documented how anti-Israel activists embedded themselves in those protests and turned a protest over domestic use of police violence into anti-Israel protests. You saw hashtags on Twitter created by groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. From Ferguson to Gaza was the hashtag. And so you tried to blame. You saw a lot of propaganda over the fact that Israeli police used the same brand of tear gas that the Ferguson police used. Of course, it was tear gas manufactured in the United States. What does one have to do with the other? The fact that Israel buys it from the same company in the U.S. that the Ferguson police bought it doesn't mean Israel is related to the use of tear gas in Ferguson. But that sort of logic never, broke through. It was this superficial claim. Israel is doing something, Ferguson police are doing something, and therefore Israel's to blame. The other thing they used, and again, I'm so familiar with this because we covered it in real time, is they claim that the Ferguson police chief trained in Israel, and therefore whatever tactics the police chief used were somehow blamed on Israel. First of all, the Ferguson police didn't train in Israel. Second of all, the police chief in question wasn't even the chief of the Ferguson police. It was the chief of the St. Louis County police, who had nothing to do with the policing in Ferguson. So you have these things that have nothing to do with each other, which were relentlessly exploited in propaganda to try to somehow blame Israel for what happened in Ferguson. Of course, we know what happened in Ferguson was a complete fabrication regarding the shooting of Michael Brown. That
Yeah, the hands up, don't shoot story was just was a myth.
Yeah, but that became the defining narrative. But that's where you saw the anti-Israeli activists, and we named them and we documented them. One of them, who's now deceased, was recently praised on the floor of the House by Cori Bush. She paid homage to him. He was in those crowds trying to turn the crowds against Israel in 2014. That's intersectionality and how it's used against Israel. Two things that have nothing to do with each other, but have some superficial connection, are then exploited.
Yeah, and it revolves around the phrase, people of color. Of course, there are two problems with that. Number one, the majority of Israeli Jews are, by that same definition, people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East or North Africa, and would, in an American context, be considered people of color. And the other is that this entire idea of sort of weaponizing people of color as a way to decide who is in the right and who is in the wrong, it kind of creates this it's a natural fit for the political left. But I guess my question is there a limit to the ability of these activists to sort of harness these ideas to anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hate? Or do they just have carte blanche to do it and to have these ideas welcomed in academia and given an entrance into the public square as well?
Well, there's certainly a logical limit, but there doesn't seem to be a political limit or a practical limit on campuses. You have a lot of faculty, including at Cornell, who buy into these, who promote them, who are there to give aid and comfort to students perpetrating these things. You have professional activist groups who are doing it. There's a lot of money behind it. And then you have the as a Jew activists, meaning people who use their Jewish identity to give cover to this hatred of Israel and, frankly, this anti-Jewish hatred. Because what it's doing, it is portraying an us versus them. And the them are Jews, and the us is everybody else. That's what's happening. And they say, oh, but we're not anti-Semitic. We just hate Israel. And, but why do you hate Israel? Well, you hate Israel because it's Jewish. You didn't hate Jordan when Jordan occupied what's now called the West Bank. You didn't hate Egypt when Egypt occupied what's now Gaza. In fact, as I'm sure you're aware, the first Palestinian national document, which came out prior to 1967, national charter, expressly disavowed any Palestinian claim to the West Bank and Gaza because they were occupied by people who weren't Jews. So the entire ideology on campus has become, people of color versus Jews, even if that's not a correct formulation. And no wonder it's such a hostile environment for Jews on campuses.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Your website, Legal Insurrection, has really become essential reading for those seeking to push back against these ideas. It's become sort of an institution in its own right. I guess my question is, how have you managed to maintain it as well as an academic career in the heart of an elite institution where there is such hostility to these ideas? And can you tell us about efforts to cancel you at Cornell?
Yeah, well, the efforts to cancel me at Cornell really started about 2 to 3 weeks after I formed my website in 2008. But at that time, it was almost exclusively from off the campus, or really was exclusively from off the campus. It was essentially mainstream Obama Democrats who did not like the fact that an Ivy League law school had a conservative on the faculty and a conservative who was outspoken politically. And that kept up for many, many years, some fairly intense harassment, threats, things like that. But it was always off the campus, and it was from mainstream Democrats, frankly. That changed in 2020 when, after the George Floyd killing, I saw everybody marching around saying, hands up, don't shoot. And I'd written about this multiple times in the past, that actually didn't happen, okay? It's a fabrication from the Michael Brown case. So I wrote about that. and I wrote, and I'd written literally the exact same post 2 to 3 times prior over the years with no real reaction. And in fact, I titled the post Reminder, okay, because I'm reminding people of things I've already written. Hands Up, Don't Shoot is a fabricated narrative from the Michael Brown case, that he wasn't shot with his hands up. He wasn't saying don't shoot. He was shot when he punched a policeman in the face and tried to steal his weapon. That's what the local prosecutors found and why the policeman wasn't prosecuted. And that's what the Eric Holder Barack Obama Justice Department found when they did an investigation. So there's nothing to it. Well, I think it was a sign of the times. I think it was just people were so agitated. People basically lost their mind at Cornell Law School. Alumni sent letters.
As they did in much of the rest of the country,
Yes.
and
I mean, it was
a moral panic.
It was a unique moment in time. It was a unique few weeks, and there were many other professors who expressed any sort of disagreement. So there were letters from alumni organized to get me fired. There was an alumni petition to get me fired. The 21 of my closest colleagues signed a letter against me. The dean denounced me, and 15 student groups boycotted me unsuccessfully, I will note. And nobody ever said what you said is wrong or factually wrong. They just disagreed with my opinion. They felt it was insensitive for me to publish the truth. At that time, I wrote a separate post that they also criticized, although that it was the Michael Brown post that got things started, where I criticized the rioting and the looting. I pointed out accurately that the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement were Marxists and did not have our country's interests in heart. And they took my words, the activist leaders, and turned it into, oh, you're against everybody who's protesting. I mean, it was a complete distortion, but it was one of these moral panics. There were faculty members I'd known for 10 years, people I considered friends, who rushed to sign a letter in the Cornell Sun newspaper against me, but didn't even give me a phone call to explain, well, why do you believe this? What facts do you have that show that Michael Brown wasn't hands up, don't shoot? You know, why are you calling the leaders of the movement Marxist? What evidence do you have? Well, we've got plenty of evidence. Nobody did that. It was this absolute rush to get somebody. Fortunately, because I do have a website and because I do have a lot of notoriety in conservative media world, people rushed to my defense. I did not back down one bit because I had nothing to back down about. But there are other professors who came under that at the time for similar circumstances who didn't really have that wherewithal and that ability to get attention. And that was me. And it was, something that, whether it's blown over or not, is a little too early to tell. I think, some people have long memories. We'll see what happens. But it lasted intensively for a month or two. And then, the student boycott really failed. We had a huge sign up just for the fall of 2020, just after they called to boycott me. There was a lot of student dissent about it, but it was all quiet. I received many emails from students saying, do not think that these activists represent everybody. You have a lot of support in the building. And the phrase that a couple of people used was, you have quiet support, that there are people who support you, but they're all afraid to speak out. And that, I think, was true. Received a lot of support from around the country. So that's the sort of thing you face if you speak out nowadays. And we'll see if that recurs in the future.
Yeah, I think clearly you're the exception that proves the rule. Somebody in academia who came, got in the crosshairs of the woke left and stood up to it and was able to survive it. So many other stories involving this usually end with, sort of struggle sessions and hostage tape apologies. In basically every sphere of American life, with people who found themselves under similar criticism. I guess that the question that arises from that is, as a person who is on campus, what does the lack of room for dissent against these sort of leftist orthodoxies mean for higher education, especially at elite schools where, which are sort of the ticket to the people who are going to be running the country? How does that impact us?
It's a very strange environment, and it's true at Cornell and it's true elsewhere, where you have a dominant political culture, which is almost completely dominant. You have people refusing or afraid to speak out. But it doesn't mean everybody agrees with them. It just means they have captured the public dialogue around issues, because nobody wants to be called racist, homophobic, etc. Even if you're not. I mean, you end up having to defend yourself against, frivolous and scurrilous accusations, and that's what you spend your time doing. So students learn the lesson, and I can't blame them. Just keep your mouth shut. And that's what I understand the students at the law school who didn't want to go public. They're 23, 24, 25 years old. They're going to be out in the job market soon. If there's stuff written about them on the internet, calling them all sorts of nasty names, employers are going to see that, and they just won't get jobs. And they'll never be told that's why. They just won't get a call back. And so I understand this power of social media. Social media has been one of the most pernicious and destructive forces in terms of public dialogue, because it enables people who have totalitarian tendencies to find other people who have totalitarian tendencies and join together with relatively low cost, if no cost, and attack people. And so I understand why students stay silent. Foundation for Individual Rights in Education has done surveys of campuses, and they just released one recently, and they did one a year ago. And what it finds, and it's pretty true across campuses, someplace around 2/3 of students, maybe edging up towards 70%, on campuses at the schools they surveyed, originally I think it was 50 schools, now it's up to 100, feel they cannot express themselves politically on campus. They cannot express their views. And so they stay quiet. They're intimidated. And it's, oddly enough, as true with students who self-identify as liberal as it is with students who self-identify as conservative. It's the far left, it's the progressives who are causing this problem. There was a letter in the Cornell Sun newspaper a few months ago by self-identified liberal students. That's how they identify themselves, decrying the hostile campus culture, the campus culture that does not allow for open debate. So this is really not a conservative versus liberal problem. It's a progressive movement that is enforcing its orthodoxy on campuses by attacking people. And there are stories I've heard about what's going on at Cornell against conservative students that are not public because they confided in me, which are absolutely horrifying and would turn your stomach, as to how these far left progressive students, how aggressive they are in trying to deplatform people, get students kicked out of clubs, anything where they see some sort of political transgression. So the lesson is that 5 to 10% of the campus controls close to 100% of the public dialogue.
Yeah, that's a frightening. That's a frightening formula, and it's interesting. We often speak of the toxic influence of social media because it empowered far right extremists who would otherwise be isolated, on farms in Idaho or Montana. But in truth, just open up Twitter and every day, see see a name that's trending, and almost always it's progressives attacking some public figure for saying something that they didn't like. And when you get sort of on a smaller scale in a campus, I mean, that just becomes completely oppressive, doesn't it?
It does, and the students, definitely feel it. And the administration, unfortunately, and this is again true at many universities, not just Cornell, but I've experienced it at Cornell, when a dean of a law school denounces a professor but says we can't take disciplinary action against him because he has job protection and academic freedom, that's a very pernicious statement. That's a statement to everybody who doesn't have that protection, that if you get out of line, you're going to get disciplined. The president of the university, and absolutely astounding, in some ways worse than what they did to me, there was a chemistry professor at Cornell who, right after George Floyd's killing, there was a protest in Buffalo, New York, where an older protester, a known activist, was pushed by police. He stumbled backwards. He wasn't pushed hard, but enough to get him backpedaling. He kind of tripped over his own feet and hit his head on the ground. And this professor tweeted that basically he shouldn't have been there, and he got what he asked for. There was the 5,000 or 10,000 signature change.org petition. It was an absolute fury. The entire senior leadership of Cornell University denounced him in a presidential statement. The president, the provost, 2 or 3 senior vice presidents, even the police chief of Cornell denounced this chemistry professor. But in fact, he was right. A year later, the prosecutors announced they were not going to be pressing charges against the policeman because he did nothing wrong, that the protester should not have been in the area. It was a closed area, should not have approached the police line. You can see on the video that the protester was reaching for the policeman's belt at the time he was pushed back. And so the chemistry professor did nothing wrong. I emailed the communications people at Cornell. I said, now that the policeman's been cleared, are you going to issue an apology to this chemistry professor? No response. But what message does that send, where the entire senior leadership of a major university denounces a professor, but of course says we can't do anything because he has tenure?
Yeah, obviously the answer is keep your mouth shut.
Keep your mouth shut.
Unless you have job security.
That's right.
There's no other way to look at it.
Even if you have job security, you're going to be paraded, metaphorically paraded around and denounced like professors during the Cultural Revolution, where you'd be put on a stage and jeered. That's what happens when university. But that's a very common reaction. I just witnessed it up front at Cornell. But it happens at many universities. The first reaction is to denounce the professor. Happened recently at San Diego Law School for a professor who criticized the Chinese handling of coronavirus. It was clear in the context that he was talking. He was talking about the Chinese government, okay? But student activists, and most of these things are led by students. Student activists claimed he was criticizing Chinese people as an ethnic group. I mean, it was just not right. But the dean at San Diego Law School rushed out a condemnation, and he was later cleared in a university investigation, found that he didn't violate any of the anti-discrimination policies. But it happens all the time. A student mob gathers over something totally ridiculous, and the administration capitulates.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that a professor could be put through a process in which his career is sort of on the line is itself deeply offensive and destructive of academic freedom. But the point is, if the teachers are so cowed by all of this, how much more so are students who wish to push against whatever leftist narrative we're talking about, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement or attacks on Israel?
That's right. And I think a lot of pro-Israel students, I won't even say just Jewish students, but students who have favorable feelings towards Israel, many of whom, if not most of whom, are Jewish, also are afraid to express those views. I mean, we've seen at Cornell students physically attacked for expressing pro-Israel views. There was an incident a few years ago where Jewish students were confronted and spit on. We documented it at my website. That person was not a student doing it. It was an activist from Ithaca who was then barred from the campus. But the point is, there is this intimidation factor. The pro-Israel Israel Independence Day event in 2017 was disrupted by Students for Justice in Palestine. They took over the room and did a sit-in. They could have protested out in the hallway or outside the building, but they invaded the space. Nothing was done. They may have a right to protest. They don't have a right to take over the space you're using for your own event and essentially force you out. And so these things happen all the time. But you will never, I can't recall a single instance, I can't say there's not been one, but where a pro-Palestinian event is disrupted in that way, where there's a physical attack on a pro-Palestinian event. And there are thousands of them a year at universities. There's this mythology that the Palestinian perspective is being silenced on campus. Nothing could be further from the truth. every campus in this country practically, certainly, top tier universities are awash in pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel events, conferences, protests. It's everywhere. So that's what it's like. So this thing that started really as the silencing of conservatives on campus 10 years ago, 15 years ago, has changed over time to silencing just about everybody who does not agree with the progressive agenda.
Yeah. I want to just switch slightly to discussing critical race theory. It's become one of the touchstones of political debate in 2021. Yet, even after it became a major issue and a major factor in the outcome in the Virginia gubernatorial election, the key talking point in much of the mainstream media from the left and from even mainstream liberals was that it's either totally innocuous, as Joe Biden said, during a presidential debate against Trump, it's just, sensitivity training rather than a political indoctrination session. But we keep being told it's not actually happening. It's not a real thing, as some of the talking heads on CNN and MSNBC say. They say it's not being taught in the schools or influencing teachers in their training. But your criticalrace.org, kind of has an answer to that. And tell us, what is the answer? Is it real? Is it actually going on?
Yes, but we get into a little bit of a word game here. The term critical race theory was coined a year or two ago as an umbrella term for all of these things that are going on. But because that term was chosen, it has allowed people to say, oh, well, what's happening is not quote unquote critical race theory. That is a legal doctrine, a legal approach taught only in law schools. And there's a tiny kernel of truth in that. It's just tiny, which is you will never see in fifth grade a book called Critical Race Theory. That is not how it works. What it is, and I prefer the term, it's the complete racialization of education. Everything, so critical race theory focuses on race as the central factor in the organization of society, and that legal systems are meant to enforce a hierarchy and enforce an oppression, even if you don't see it, and the things that are seemingly neutral, doctrines of law, are actually part of a systemic racism that oppresses Black people. That's how it started. But it's that singular focus on race which has trickled down, and that's what you see. So you see almost everywhere in education now, race being the dominant feature of everything. Math has to be looked through a racial prism. Physics has to be looked through it. Certainly the humanities and the social sciences. Everything. It's almost not an overstatement. I should say almost everything revolves around race and how you approach it. And that is what critical race theory is. And that's what you see everywhere. You see young children being taught about, white privilege. You see all these different privilege wheels. You see privilege walks. You see all different sorts of things. But it's always a focus on race as the driving factor. And so, yes, critical race theory, as the term is used as an umbrella term for the racialization of education, is everywhere. Critical race theory as a legal approach to the law is not taught in third grade. So I think it's probably the proper term to have used, because you need a term to describe something. But having picked that term, it's like Bill Clinton arguing, what is the meaning of is? So now we get into these extended discussions about whether, segregating children by race for different training things, segregating teachers. Is that critical race theory, or is that not critical race theory? Who cares? It's the racialization of education. It's the principles drawn from critical race theory. And there are many statements by people involved in this where they have acknowledged it. There's a lot that's been leaked, videos, things like that, saying that I think even the founder of one of the founders of critical race theory, who also invented intersectionality, is on tape talking about how the principles of critical race theory have now moved down into K through 12. And that's really what's happening. It's this focus on race. It's so destructive. I mean, it's so destructive to teach young children that their fate in life is dictated by the color of their skin. And that if they have light skin, they're going to be an oppressor and privileged. And if they have dark skin, they're going to be a victim and can't escape from that. Because we know it's not true. That's not to say there's not racism in the country like there is in the whole world, okay? But it is not the dominant feature of our society. We can teach students to show their proof in math. That is not a feature of white supremacy. You know, we can teach students that meritocracy is a good thing, that they should actually try to do well on exams. And the fact that there might be different outcomes for different groups is not a reflection of racism. There may be other reasons for that. And maybe we should be putting more resources to helping the groups that aren't doing as well. But that's a very different scheme than saying our society is systemically racist and you, the young child, young black child in kindergarten or first grade, have no real future in this world. There's a teacher that we brought public on my website taught in Providence Middle School, Ramona Bessinger. And she saw this happen in real time, and she went public on our website about it, and then it kind of took off from there, and she got a lot of national publicity. How the racialized oppressed narrative in the new curriculum in her middle school was turning the students against her. She's white, and the students in her school are essentially 100% non-white. Okay, it's an inner city Providence school. And they started calling her America. You're America. We're not America, because she's white and they're not. And so what it does is it teaches students they have no future in this country. The country is hostile against them. And she's been subject to retaliation for speaking out about this. But that's what it does. It turns students against each other. It turns students against their teachers. It turns teachers against teachers. Teachers have screamed at her that she has white privilege in front of other people. And so it's such a destructive thing to teach people, to teach children particularly, that everything in life revolves around the color of their skin. And that's what's happening. So yes, that is the outgrowth of critical race theory. No, the Providence Middle School did not have a book called Introduction to Critical Race Theory. That's not how it works.
Yeah, I think there's so much commentary on this that is utterly disingenuous. I mean, I wrote about an instance of a middle school in New York City, where children were literally subjected to racial division and selection. And it was a very diverse school with a lot of Asians, a lot of blacks, Hispanics, as well as some whites. And their whole, their training program about learning about racial issues in American history, they were literally separated into different racial groups. It's mind-boggling as to how this would do anything but further divide us, further divide them, set them at each other's throats, literally, by doing that. And yet, the chattering classes still try to pretend this isn't about a sort of a revolution in education in which everything becomes racialized.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, everywhere, when we do a lot of research on this, everywhere we go, we bump into the teachers' unions. Okay, they're so deeply involved in this, they are pushing it. The National Education Association at least had the honesty at their recent annual meeting to formally endorse it. Okay, and so they very quickly went from it's not happening, you're making it up, it's all fake, to we endorse it and it should be everywhere. Okay, the American Federation of Teachers, it's not happening, it's not real, you're lying, you're making it up, it's a vast dark money right-wing conspiracy. To we're creating a legal fund to defend every school teacher who teaches critical race theory. So you need a legal fund if it's not happening. The teachers' unions are very deep into this. A lot of people ask me why, what's in it for them? And I don't really know what's in it for them. I think probably, as with many of these groups, a third of them are just true believers. They believe this.
Yeah, it's about ideology.
You know,
Not they're not profiting from
and
it.
it's also, though, it's a power thing, okay?
Yes.
Somehow the teachers' unions in this country have gone from negotiating the terms and conditions of employment, how many days do you get for vacation, what's your sick leave, to actually dictating our curriculum. And that's something people are going to have to come to. The teachers' unions in this country, through their members, through their involvement in taking over school boards, de facto taking over school boards because they support certain candidates, they are now the driving force in the curriculum in this country.
Yeah, I want to just touch, that there are a lot of aspects of this that we can talk about, but, as the, legal insurrection, your blog, it started when blogs were the way we talk about things. We don't really talk about blogs so much as websites nowadays. And you chose, a provocative name for it about sort of pushing back against establishment. The word insurrection has a lot of baggage in 2021. How is that impact? Because in essence, after the Capitol 6 riot on the Capitol riot on January 6th, basically anybody who sort of dissented against the Biden administration whether they were protesting against critical race theory in the schools or anything else, got called insurrectionists. How have you weathered, the additional baggage of that title in this year?
Yeah, well, we started using it in 2008, okay? And the term is actually an oxymoron. You cannot have a legal insurrection. The way I came up with the term was completely haphazard. I had an argument with a former client of mine. He thought I should start a blog, etc. Said, okay, I need a name. How am I feeling? This would be September 2008. Very frustrated with the media bias in favor of Obama against, John McCain. And the word insurrection came to mind. And so and I looked it up, and an insurrection by definition is illegal. I said, I recently started a job at a law school. Maybe that's not the best thing. Why don't I call it legal insurrection? So it just came up haphazardly. It's kind of a contradiction in terms, and it's worked for 13 years. People, told me recently, consultant type people, maybe you should change your name. I said, no, we're not changing our name. It's been good for 13 years, and it's our brand, and we started it in 2008. But yeah, I think that people do get a little intimidated by that word, but that's because of things having nothing to do with us. So we're not changing it, and it is what it is, and that's how people know us.
Yeah. In some cases, it could be a badge of honor to be an insurrectionist against sort of unaccountable establishments rather than literally a rebel against the government. But, we're in a very literal time, and people sort of don't have lost their sense of humor clearly about some things.
Yeah.
I want to talk about another. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Our motto is arising up against authority in accordance with and as permitted by law. So that's right on our website, and it's been there for 13 years.
Yeah, it's a very polite insurrection in that
right.
sense. I think one of the sort of most discouraging aspects of this is not just what happens, on college campuses, as disturbing as that is, and the way that has of leaching into the rest of the public square, is the way the woke takeover of the media has created. These are ideas that were once really, limited to the fever swamps of our culture. Now they're not merely mainstream academia; they're mainstream, dictating political coverage. And I think these ideas about race and kind of filter into so many other things. You've written a lot recently about how coverage of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial sort of worked into this entire idea about sort of intersectionality and critical race theory. Explain a little bit about how that worked and how that sort of distorted the coverage of what otherwise should have been a fairly straightforward, criminal trial.
Yeah, one of the things I almost feel, and I've written this many times, we're now in like a post-truth world. The truth of these cases does not matter. And it's a very well-oiled machine, starting with the Trayvon Martin case to the Michael Brown case to many others, where you have activists who exploit these cases, put a racial twinge on them when there is none. In the Trayvon Martin case, NBC News actually doctored audio of the 911 call. You had George Zimmerman calling into 911 saying, I see this person walking around. He looks suspicious. 911 asks him, is he black, white, or Hispanic? He says he's black. Well, what does NBC News play? They take out the question in the middle. And so you have, I see this person, he looks suspicious, he's black. That's the audio they actually played. They made it a racial case immediately. George Zimmerman was multiracial, of mixed race background. Okay, the FBI did an investigation, found no evidence that he had any racial hostility towards anyone. But they take a case which is non-racial and turn it into a race issue, and the activists then exploit it, and the media exploits it. So forever to this day, the Trayvon Martin case is the white guy who shot the black kid. And in fact, the news media came up with the term I don't think anybody had ever heard of before, called George Zimmerman, a white Hispanic. Okay, and you saw that in the Kyle Rittenhouse case. You have a white kid who shoots 3 white people, and all of a sudden that is turned into a race issue. And many people are coming out, you've seen a lot of it on Twitter and elsewhere, saying, based on the media coverage, I thought he traveled to Wisconsin and shot 3 black people at a George Floyd protest. And that's not what happened. The media doesn't care about the truth. And that happens again and again. And so we're in this post-truth world where race dominates everything. The social media influencers put a racial tone on it. And I bet you that probably half this country, at least to the extent they're even aware of the case, the ones who are aware probably still think to this day that Kyle Rittenhouse was a racist, white, supremacist militia member who traveled with an illegal weapon across state lines to shoot peaceful black protesters. None of that is true. He had family and grew up partially in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He didn't bring the weapon across state lines. The weapon was not illegal for him to possess. The judge threw those charges out. It was lawful for him to possess it. The people he shot were not black, and they certainly weren't peaceful. We have video, thank God there's video of how intensely violent they were towards him. He shot one of them when the guy pulled a gun on him and held it 3 feet from Kyle's head. The other one was beating him with a skateboard. And the third one, a multi-time convicted child rapist, who had just gotten out of prison and just been released from hospitalization for some sort of psychosis, attacked him and tried to grab his gun. So you have a case that has literally nothing to do with race, has been turned into a huge racial issue by the media, by the social media activists, influencers, and by the activists. And that's unfortunately where we are as a society.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. And, it's it's a story that keeps playing out every time there's one of these controversial trials. You've outlined for us how intersectionality and critical race theory facilitate anti-Semitism. We've talked about that in a college environment. How would you evaluate the efforts of mainstream Jewish groups to fight this, either on campuses or in the political sphere, considering that this is something that is critical to Jewish security in this country?
I think the efforts from mainstream Jewish groups have been pathetic, They were falling all over themselves to endorse the Black Lives Matter movement without, I think, having any real understanding of what it was, or if they did understand what it was, they ignored it because anybody who followed that movement knew that anti-Israel activists were deeply embedded in it from the start, And so the Black Lives Matter movement had endorsed BDS 2 or 3 years ago. But you have all these Jewish, purportedly pro-Israel groups who wanted a virtue signal and wanted to jump on the bandwagon. And frankly, I think we're afraid these mobs would come for them and jumped right on the bandwagon without really understanding it. And that created a problem because as many people say, you can endorse a movement to give equality and fair treatment to all people, including black people, and you can endorse a movement that supports and values black lives without endorsing this particular group and this particular movement, which is highly manipulative. And that's the problem. So they've dug themselves, or they've painted themselves into a corner. They've fully endorsed the movement, but the movement is turning on them. And now what are they going to do? So I think mainstream Jewish groups have painted themselves into a corner. I don't know how they get out of it. I don't know that they even want to get out of it.
Yeah, I was about to say, clearly, groups like the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is the association of all community relations councils in the country, and of course the Anti-Defamation League, they're still doubling down on this. Even, seeking to identify everything, including I saw the ADL was their reaction to the Rittenhouse trial verdict was to say that white militias and extremists were happy about it, as if to say that is the only people who could possibly think that was a just outcome were white nationalists, white supremacists, racists, anti-Semites. A complete distortion of the truth.
ADL is a whole other issue. I'm sure we could have and probably have had a whole show just on how they have been corrupted.
Yeah, I think both of us were on such a show earlier this year.
So there's a lot to say about how they've been corrupted and turned from a group that was devoted to fighting anti-Semitism to a group now which is just an adjunct of the Democrat Party and a social justice movement, and is very quick to criticize and paint everything as a white supremacist issue. Yes, there are some white supremacist groups in the country who do pose a threat of violence, but as a political force, they are minuscule. If you're a Jewish student on a campus in the U.S., the chance that you're going to run into a hostility from a member of a white militia is minuscule. You're more likely to run into hostility from Students for Justice for Palestine or any of their related offshoot groups, should you dare to express any sort of affection or support for Israel. So these groups have really been corrupted. The ADL is just terrible now in my mind. The ADL is the leading group seeking internet censorship. Okay. Yes. They said they want it, and they couch it in terms of, well, we don't want hate speech on these different platforms. Well, nobody wants hate speech on those platforms, but who gets to define hate speech? Let me tell you, ADL, on virtually every campus in this country, you know what is considered hate speech? Expressing support for Israel. And there are people who would take what you're doing and use it to ban Zionist groups on campus in a heartbeat. So ADL is going down a very dangerous road where they are not distinguishing between people who pose a threat of violence versus people who they just don't agree with. Because on campuses, Israel is unpopular, and using the ADL standard, if the students on campuses use the ADL standard of hate speech, every pro-Israel group would be banned.
Including the ADL.
Including the ADL. So
but yet they do this because they identify this with a political, a partisan divide in which they're clearly on one side of it. Yeah. But yes, I mean, that's the irony. They are placing their own constituents in harm's way in this way. And
in fact, in the Deadly Exchange activist movement, which has now expanded to campuses, ADL is one of the targets, because these were ADL-sponsored trips for U.S. police chiefs to get anti-terrorism training in Israel, which are now being used to demonize everybody who supports Israel, to paint Israel as a white supremacist society, to paint supporters. So ADL is literally the target of these people on campuses, but ADL doesn't see it that way. It's been good for their fundraising. Jonathan Greenblatt has been very good for their fundraising. They're getting tons of corporate money, but they've really corrupted their mission, and they're doing tremendous damage to the country and to the cause of people who support Israel.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I want to just, in our last question before we run out of time, I want to focus on how this has sort of morphed into, from the campus, the media, but it's also about politics. it's also been mainstreamed. And, there are now 2 members of the United States Congress who are open supporters of the BDS movement, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And the treatment of those 2, especially Ilhan Omar, has sort of I find that they're kind of being mainstreamed. Their views, whenever they are attacked, and there was a recent incident in which a Republican congresswoman was mouthed off to Ilhan Omar in a somewhat abusive, certainly unparliamentary way, Lauren Boebert. And yet the sort of Jewish groups and even prominent Jewish members of the press are treating Ilhan Omar like a martyr, as if her anti-Semitism isn't an issue. How is that playing into the to the battle against anti-Semitism? And isn't this undermining our ability to call out anti-Semitism where it exists and where it's being inspired by these leftist ideologies that we've spoken about?
Well, that's a problem in the Democratic Party, in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, in the Democratic Socialists of America, that, this anti-Israelism bleeding over into anti-Semitism, and certain Ilhan Omar is the prime example of that. She has said things that Democrats couldn't even bring themselves to condemn. They had to do a both sides sort of resolution in the House. Yet which of her crazy statements it was that generated that, but soon after she joined, there was something she said that generated a lot of controversy.
Yeah, well, it's all about the Benjamins.
All about the Benjamins.
Her claim that the Jews were buying Congress.
That's right, and they couldn't even bring themselves to straight out condemn that. Okay, they had to do a kind of both sides sort of thing. Well, there's this and there's that, and very watered down. Right, so it's a real problem in the Democratic Party. And I think it's a problem, because they're all scared to death of the Squad, and they're all scared to death of the Democratic Socialists. It's a question of when are they going to stand up to it. So, yes, Ilhan Omar gets kid glove treatment by the media, by the Democrats. And if you're a Republican and you say something, you're going to, be the center of a firestorm. But if you're a Democrat and you say something, it's brushed under the rug, and she's the prime example of that.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. Well, Bill, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. You've explored a lot of these issues, given us a great many insights. We want to thank you for coming on today. We want to thank our audience for tuning in, whether they are listening on any of the various podcast platforms, Spotify, Google, Amazon, or they're watching it on the JNS YouTube channel, the video version, or eventually watching us on JBS TV. Thank you for watching and listening. Please like, subscribe, give us good reviews wherever you are listening or watching this. And thank you, and we'll see you again next week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, brought to you by the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org. Visit us at JNS.org, and please follow at Amazon and Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts.